John stood in the middle of his small apartment, staring at the door that had just slammed shut, its echo vibrating through the walls. Emily was gone. The weight of her words hung in the air, suffocating in its finale. I don't love you anymore. It's over. 3 years of shared laughter, late-night talks, and moments that once seemed to promise forever had suddenly dissipated, evaporating into a cold, hollow nothingness. John blinked, trying to understand how this could be happening. His chest felt tight, his breath uneven. The quiet that followed Emily's departure was deafening. The apartment that had once been their shared haven now felt alien. The familiar scent of her shampoo still lingered in the air, but it was already beginning to feel like a ghost of something that no longer existed. Bombed the photos of them, smiling at the beach, making silly faces at a diner, dressed up for some wedding they attended last summer, stared at him from the walls. They seemed frozen in time, remnants of a past that had crumbled in an instant. John took a deep breath, but it caught in his throat, rattling on its way out, as if his body couldn't figure out how to function without her. He moved, almost on autopilot, his feet dragging across the living room. His eyes traced the outline of the coffee table, cluttered with the ordinary detritus of daily life. Her half-finished crossword puzzle, a candle they'd both liked for its lavender scent, a stray sock that had been thrown there without much thought. How could everything still be here, untouched, as if it hadn't just all fallen apart? He bent down to pick up the sock, and his fingers clenched around the fabric, knuckles turning white. It was absurd, the triviality of it. He couldn't make sense of what had happened, of what Emily had said. 3 years. 3 years they had spent building a life, intertwining themselves into something more, or so he had believed. He replayed the argument in his head, the words, the tone, the way she had looked at him, her eyes vacant of the warmth they used to hold. She had spoken calmly, her voice devoid of anger or frustration. It was that emptiness that cut through him the most, as if she had already left him long before her body physically walked out of the door. He remembered her saying she just didn't feel the same anymore, that they had drifted apart, that there was no one else but also no love left between them. Each sentence was like another blow, hollowing out his chest until there was nothing left but a dull ache. John stumbled towards the kitchen, his hand reaching instinctively for the fridge door. He opened it, the cold air hitting his face as he pulled out a beer. He twisted off the cap, the metal biting into his fingers, and took a long drink, hoping for some kind of relief, something to dull the thoughts running through his mind. The bitter liquid went down his throat, burning slightly, but it did nothing to ease the tension coiled in his body. He leaned against the counter, staring blankly at the kitchen floor, trying to hold on to something, anything that might make sense of what had just happened. He tried to think back to when it all started going wrong, but there was no clear answer. There was no single fight, no major betrayal. It had just been a series of small moments, missed connections, tired silences, little disappointments that had added up over time. He remembered the nights when they sat on opposite ends of the couch, both scrolling on their phones, the silence between them growing heavier. He remembered how the laughter that used to fill the apartment had slowly faded, replaced by small talk that felt forced. He remembered her eyes, how they no longer lit up when she looked at him, and how, deep down, he had known something was wrong but was too scared to confront it. John swallowed hard, feeling the sting of tears that threatened to spill. He clenched his jaw, trying to push the emotions down, trying to keep himself together. He took another drink from the bottle, his hand shaking slightly as he brought it to his lips. He didn't know how to do this, how to be alone again. He had grown so used to having Emily by his side, to waking up next to her, to planning his days around their shared routines. The thought of coming home to an empty apartment every day, of not hearing her laugh or seeing her smile, was almost unbearable. He moved away from the counter, pacing the small kitchen. His mind raced, replaying every moment of their relationship, searching for answers. He thought about the first time they had met, the way she had smiled at him from across the room, her eyes sparkling with curiosity. He remembered their first date, how they had stayed up talking until the early hours of the morning, sharing stories and dreams. He remembered the way she had looked at him when she said, "I love you," for the first time, her voice soft, her eyes filled with emotion. He remembered all the little moments. The late-night drives, the lazy Sunday mornings, the way she used to dance around the kitchen when her favorite song came on. It all felt so real, so vivid in his memory, and yet now it felt like it had happened to someone else, like it was all just a story he had read in a book. He couldn't understand how it had all slipped away, how they had gone from being so in love to being strangers. He felt a pang of guilt, wondering if he had missed the signs, if there was something he could have done differently. Maybe if he had paid more attention, if he had tried harder, if he had been better, things would have turned out differently. But it was too late for that now. She was gone. and there was nothing he could do to change it. John felt the tears finally spill over, and he let them fall, his body shaking as he cried. He cried for what he had lost, for the future that would never be, for the love that had slipped through his fingers. He cried for the emptiness that now filled the apartment, for the loneliness that seemed to stretch out endlessly before him. He cried because he didn't know what else to do, because there was no way to fix it, no way to bring her back. He cried until he had no tears left, until he felt drained, empty, hollow. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, his eyes red and puffy. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He knew he couldn't stay like this forever, that he would have to figure out how to move on, how to put the pieces of his life back together. But in that moment, it felt impossible. The weight of it all was too much. The thought of facing the future without Emily too overwhelming. He took another drink of his beer, the bottle now almost empty, and leaned back against the counter, staring at the ceiling. The apartment was silent, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator. John closed his eyes, trying to block out the memories, trying to quiet the thoughts that wouldn't stop. He felt a deep sense of exhaustion, a weariness that went beyond the physical. He wanted to sleep, to escape from the pain, but he knew that sleep wouldn't bring any relief. The emptiness would still be there when he woke up, the reality of what had happened still waiting for him. Suddenly, a knock on the door broke through the silence, startling John. He opened his eyes, blinking in confusion. He wasn't expecting anyone, and he didn't feel like seeing anyone either. The knock came again, gentle but persistent. John hesitated, then pushed himself away from the counter, making his way slowly to the door. He cracked it open, and there stood Alex, his neighbor from down the hall. Alex was looking at him with concern, his brows furrowed. "Hey, John," Alex said, his voice soft. "I heard some noise. Are you okay?" John looked at him, not knowing what to say. He wanted to tell him to go away, to leave him alone, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he just stood there, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on him. Alex seemed to understand, his expression softening. "Do you want some company?" he asked. "I brought a couple of beers." John hesitated, then sighed, stepping aside to let Alex in. He wasn't sure he wanted to be alone right now, and Alex had always been a decent guy. Maybe, just maybe, having someone there would make the emptiness a little less suffocating, even if just for a moment. The knock on the door was gentle but insistent, breaking the silence that had filled John's apartment since Emily had left. He looked up, startled, his eyes red from tears, his mind still spinning in the chaos of the breakup. He wasn't expecting anyone, and part of him wanted to ignore it, to retreat further into his grief. But the knocking continued, a persistent reminder that there was still a world outside, still people who cared. Slowly, almost reluctantly, John pushed himself away from the counter where he had been leaning, his half-empty beer bottle still clutched in his hand. He dragged his feet toward the door, each step feeling heavier than the last. He wasn't in the mood for company. Not now, not when everything felt so raw and exposed. Something made him open the door anyway, just a crack, enough to see who it was. Standing in the dimly lit hallway was Alex, his neighbor from down the hall. Alex had always been friendly, never intrusive, but always there with a smile or a nod when they passed each other. Now, though, his face was serious, his eyes filled with concern. He looked at John for a moment, taking in his disheveled appearance, the redness in his eyes, the way his shoulders seemed to sag under the weight of something invisible. "Hey, John," Alex said, his voice soft, careful. "I heard some noise. Are you okay?" John hesitated, unsure how to respond. Was he okay? No, not really. He felt like a shell, hollowed out and fragile, the edges of his emotions still sharp and jagged. He wanted to say something, to tell Alex to leave, that he wanted to be alone, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he just stood there staring at Alex, his mind blank. Alex seemed to understand the silence, or at least he didn't push for an answer. He gave John a small, sympathetic smile, his eyes never leaving John's face. "I brought a couple of beers," he said, lifting a small bag he had in his hand. "Thought maybe you could use some company." John blinked, looking at the bag, then back at Alex. Part of him wanted to say no, to close the door and retreat back into the quiet of his apartment, to let the emptiness swallow him whole. But another part, a smaller, quieter part, knew that being alone right now might be the worst thing he could do. He didn't trust himself to speak, so instead, he just nodded and stepped aside, opening the door wider to let Alex in. Alex entered the apartment, moving with a kind of careful ease, as if he knew how fragile everything was in that moment. He set the bag down on the kitchen counter and pulled out 2 bottles of beer, handing one to John before opening his own. John took it, his hand still trembling slightly, and took a long drink, the cold liquid a small comfort in the midst of everything else. They moved to the living room, settling onto the couch. Alex didn't say anything at first, and John was grateful for that. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was gentle, understanding. Alex wasn't here to demand answers or force John to talk about what had happened. He was just there, a steady presence in the midst of the storm that had torn through John's life. John stared at the floor, his thoughts still swirling, but somehow the presence of another person made it all feel a little less overwhelming. He could still hear Emily's words in his head, still feel the weight of her leaving. But now there was something else too, something that kept him anchored, kept him from drifting too far into his own grief. After a while, Alex spoke, his voice soft, almost hesitant. "You don't have to say anything if you don't want to," he said, his eyes focused on the beer bottle in his hand. "But I'm here, just if you need someone." John glanced at him, his vision blurry with unshed tears. He didn't know what to say, didn't know how to put into words the mess of emotions he was feeling. But Alex wasn't pushing him, wasn't demanding anything from him. He was just there. And for the first time since Emily had walked out, John felt a small flicker of something other than pain. It wasn't hope, not yet, but it was something. A reminder that maybe he wasn't as alone as he felt. They sat like that for a long time, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. John didn't know how much time passed, but eventually, he found himself leaning back against the couch, his body relaxing just a little. He looked over at Alex, who gave him a small, reassuring smile. It wasn't much, but it was enough. For now, it was enough. The emptiness was still there, the pain still raw, but with Alex sitting beside him, it felt just a little bit more bearable. And maybe that was all he could ask for in that moment. The knock on the door was gentle but insistent, breaking the silence that had filled John's apartment since Emily had left. He looked up, startled, his eyes red from tears, his mind still spinning in the chaos of the breakup. He wasn't expecting anyone, and part of him wanted to ignore it, to retreat further into his grief. But the knocking continued, a persistent reminder that there was still a world outside, still people who cared. Slowly, almost reluctantly, John pushed himself away from the counter where he had been leaning, his half-empty beer bottle still clutched in his hand. He dragged his feet toward the door, each step feeling heavier than the last. He wasn't in the mood for company, not now, not when everything felt so raw and exposed. But something made him open the door anyway, just a crack enough to see who it was. Standing in the dimly lit hallway was Alex, his neighbor from down the hall. Alex had always been friendly, never intrusive, but always there with a smile or a nod when they passed each other. Now, though, his face was serious, his eyes filled with concern. He looked at John for a moment, taking in his disheveled appearance, the redness in his eyes, the way his shoulders seemed to sag under the weight of something invisible. "Hey, John," Alex said, his voice soft, careful. "I heard some noise. Are you okay?" John hesitated, unsure how to respond. Was he okay? No, not really. He felt like a shell, hollowed out and fragile, the edges of his emotions still sharp and jagged. He wanted to say something, to tell Alex to leave, that he wanted to be alone, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he just stood there, staring at Alex, his mind blank. Alex seemed to understand the silence, or at least he didn't push for an answer. He gave John a small, sympathetic smile, his eyes never leaving John's face. "I brought a couple of beers," he said, lifting a small bag he had in his hand. "Thought maybe you could use some company." John blinked, looking at the bag, then back at Alex. Part of him wanted to say no, to close the door and retreat back into the quiet of his apartment, to let the emptiness swallow him whole. But another part, a smaller, quieter part, knew that being alone right now might be the worst thing he could do. He didn't trust himself to speak, so instead, he just nodded and stepped aside, opening the door wider to let Alex in. Alex entered the apartment, moving with a kind of careful ease, as if he knew how fragile everything was in that moment. He set the bag down on the kitchen counter and pulled out 2 bottles of beer, handing one to John before opening his own. John took it, his hand still trembling slightly, and took a long drink, the cold liquid a small comfort in the midst of everything else. They moved to the living room, settling onto the couch. Alex didn't say anything at first, and John was grateful for that. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was gentle, understanding. Alex wasn't here to demand answers or force John to talk about what had happened. He was just there, a steady presence in the midst of the storm that had torn through John's life. John stared at the floor, his thoughts still swirling, but somehow the presence of another person made it all feel a little less overwhelming. He could still hear Emily's words in his head, still feel the weight of her leaving, but now there was something else too, something that kept him anchored, kept him from drifting too far into his own grief. After a while, Alex spoke, his voice soft, almost hesitant. "You don't have to say anything if you don't want to," he said. His eyes focused on the beer bottle in his hand. "But I'm here. Just if you need someone." John glanced at him, his vision blurry with unshed tears. He didn't know what to say, didn't know how to put into words the mess of emotions he was feeling. But Alex wasn't pushing him, wasn't demanding anything from him. He was just there. And for the first time since Emily had walked out, John felt a small flicker of something other than pain. It wasn't hope, not yet, but it was something, a reminder that maybe he wasn't as alone as he felt. They sat like that for a long time. The only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. John didn't know how much time passed, but eventually, he found himself leaning back against the couch, his body relaxing just a little. He looked over at Alex, who gave him a small, reassuring smile. It wasn't much, but it was enough. For now, it was enough. The emptiness was still there. The pain still raw, but with Alex sitting beside him, it felt just a little bit more bearable. And maybe that was all he could ask for in that moment. The days that followed were filled with a strange tension that seemed to hover in the air, lingering between John and Alex. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there, growing stronger with every passing interaction. The quiet evening spent on John's couch, the gentle laughter shared over a silly movie, the comforting silence of just being near each other, all of it had taken on a new weight, a new meaning that neither of them was willing to acknowledge out loud. It was as if they both knew something had changed, but neither of them wanted to risk breaking the fragile balance they had found. John tried to ignore the feelings that had begun to bloom in his chest, the way his heart would quicken whenever Alex smiled at him, the warmth that spread through him whenever their shoulders brushed as they sat together. He told himself it was just gratitude, just relief at not being alone, but the truth was harder to deny with each passing day. It wasn't just gratitude. It was something deeper, something that scared him because it was so unexpected, so unfamiliar. He hadn't planned for this, hadn't thought he could ever feel this way again, especially not after everything that had happened with Emily. There was a night, one of those quiet evenings where they had both ended up on John's couch, a movie playing on the TV that neither of them was really watching. The room was dimly lit, the only light coming from the soft glow of the screen. Alex was sitting next to him, his arm casually draped over the back of the couch, his body relaxed in a way that made John feel at ease too. It was comforting, having Alex there, the warmth of his presence filling the empty spaces that Emily had left behind. John found himself glancing over at Alex, his eyes tracing the line of his jaw, the way his eyelashes cast soft shadows on his cheeks. He felt a flutter in his chest, a mix of nervousness and something else, something that felt a lot like longing. John looked away quickly, his face heating up as he tried to focus on the movie. But the words and images on the screen blurred together, his mind too distracted to make sense of them. He could feel Alex's gaze on him, could sense that Alex had noticed the way he tensed up, and it made his heart pound even harder. He wanted to say something, to break the silence, to dispel the tension that had suddenly thickened between them. But his throat felt tight, the words stuck somewhere deep inside him. Alex shifted beside him, leaning forward slightly, his arm brushing against John's. It was a small movement, a tiny gesture, but it sent a jolt through John, his breath catching in his throat. He turned his head, his eyes meeting Alex's, and for a moment, neither of them moved. There was something in Alex's eyes, something soft and understanding, something that seemed to say, "It's okay. You don't have to be afraid." It was that look, that gentle reassurance, that made something inside John snap. Without thinking, without giving himself time to second-guess or overthink, John leaned in, closing the distance between them. His heart was pounding, his hands trembling slightly as he pressed his lips to Alex. It was a tentative kiss, hesitant and unsure, but it was real. The moment their lips met, John felt a rush of emotions, fear, relief, longing, all of it crashing over him like a wave. For a split second, he worried that he had made a mistake, that he had misread everything. But then he felt Alex respond, his lips moving gently against John's, and all of John's doubts melted away. The kiss was slow, almost cautious, as if they were both afraid of breaking the moment, of shattering whatever it was that had grown between them. John could feel the warmth of Alex's breath, the softness of his lips, and it made his heart ache in a way that was both painful and beautiful. He hadn't realized how much he needed this, how much he had longed for this kind of connection. Until that very moment, it was as if all the loneliness, all the emptiness that had consumed him since Emily had left, was finally beginning to fade, replaced by something new, something fragile but real. When they finally pulled away, Both of them were breathing heavily, their foreheads resting against each other as they tried to catch their breath. John kept his eyes closed, afraid that if he opened them, the moment would disappear, that he would wake up and find that it had all been a dream. But Alex didn't move away, didn't pull back. Instead, he stayed there, his hand coming up to rest, gently on John's cheek, his thumb brushing softly against his skin. It was a simple touch, but it held so much meaning, so much promise, and it made John's heart swell with something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Are you okay? Alex's voice was soft, barely above a whisper, and John could hear the uncertainty in it, the vulnerability. He opened his eyes then, meeting Alex's gaze, and he saw the same fear, the same hope that he felt reflected back at him. John nodded, his throat too tight to speak, and he gave Alex a small, shaky smile. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Alex smiled back, his eyes crinkling at the corners, and he leaned in, pressing a gentle kiss to John's forehead. They stayed like that for a while. The movie still playing in the background, forgotten by both of them. John rested his head against Alex's shoulder, his eyes closing as he let himself relax. Let himself just be. He didn't know what this meant, didn't know what would happen next. But for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid of the uncertainty. He had Alex, and for now, that was enough. The fear was still there, the doubts still lingered, but they were overshadowed by the warmth of Alex's arms around him, the steady beat of Alex's heart against his ear. John knew that there would be challenges ahead, that they would have to figure out what this meant for them, that there would be moments of doubt and fear. But as he sat there, wrapped in Alex's embrace, he felt a sense of peace that he hadn't felt in a long time. It was a fragile peace, one that could be easily shattered, but it was real, and it was his. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to start with. The first kiss had been unexpected, a leap into the unknown, but it had opened a door that John hadn't even realized was there. It was a door to something new, something that scared him but also filled him with a sense of wonder, a sense of possibility. He didn't know what the future held, didn't know if this was the beginning of something lasting or just a fleeting moment, but he was willing to find out. He was willing to take the risk, to let himself hope again, to let himself feel. And as the night wore on, as they sat together in the quiet of John's apartment, the weight of the past began to lift, just a little. The future was still uncertain, still full of questions that didn't have answers. But with Alex by his side, John felt like maybe, just maybe, he could face it. One step at a time, one day at a time, he could let himself believe in the possibility of something good, something real, and for the first time in what felt like forever, that was enough. The morning after that first kiss was filled with an overwhelming sense of confusion for John. The sunlight streamed through the curtains, casting a soft glow over the room, and for a moment, everything felt peaceful. But as soon as he opened his eyes and saw Alex lying next to him, his heart clenched. The previous night came rushing back. The warmth of Alex's lips, the tenderness in his gaze, the way John had felt something he hadn't felt in so long. Hope. But now in the light of day, that hope felt fragile, uncertain, and terrifying. John carefully slipped out of bed, trying not to wake Alex. He needed space, needed time to think, to understand what was happening inside him. He tiptoed around the room, gathering his clothes, his hands trembling slightly as he pulled on his shirt. He glanced back at Alex, still asleep, his face relaxed and peaceful. There was something so gentle about the way Alex looked in that moment, something that made John's chest tighten with a mix of emotions he couldn't quite name. He wanted to stay, wanted to crawl back into bed, and let himself believe that everything would be okay. But the fear was too strong. Crystal's fear of what this meant, of what he was feeling, of how everything seemed to be changing so quickly. He wasn't ready for it, wasn't ready to confront the truth that was slowly starting to take shape in his mind. He needed distance, needed to clear his head. And so he turned away, slipping out of the bedroom and quietly leaving the apartment. The door clicked softly behind him, the sound echoing in the silence of the early morning, and John felt a pang of guilt, a sense of something breaking inside him as he walked away. Back in his own apartment, John sank onto the couch, his head in his hands. His mind was racing, a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions that he couldn't untangle. He had kissed Alex. He had wanted to kiss Alex. Alex had kissed him back. It should have felt right. It had felt right in the moment. But now all he could feel was fear. Fear of what it meant about him, about who he was, about what he wanted. He had never thought of himself as someone who could fall for another man, had never imagined that he could feel this way. And yet, here he was, his heart aching with something he couldn't quite understand. The day passed in a blur. John tried to distract himself, tried to focus on anything other than the confusion swirling inside him. But nothing worked. He couldn't escape the thoughts, couldn't escape the image of Alex's face. The way he had looked at John with such care, such understanding. It made John's chest tighten, made him feel both longing and fear in equal measure. He wanted to reach out, to see Alex, to try and make sense of everything, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. He was too scared of what it would mean, too scared of what he might find if he let himself be vulnerable again. Days turned into a week, and the distance between them grew. Alex didn't push, didn't come knocking on John's door, and for that, John was both grateful and heartbroken. He knew Alex was giving him space, knew that Alex was waiting for him to come to terms with whatever it was he was feeling. But the silence between them was heavy, filled with all the things left unsaid. John missed him. He missed the quiet evenings on the couch, the way Alex's laughter filled the room, the way his presence made everything feel a little less overwhelming. But the fear was still there, holding him back, keeping him from taking that step. One evening, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the room, John found himself standing in front of Alex's door. He hadn't planned to come, hadn't meant to end up here, but his feet had carried him down the hallway before he could stop himself. He hesitated, his hand hovering inches from the door, his heart pounding in his chest. He could turn around, walk away, pretend that he hadn't been here. But the thought of going back to his empty apartment, of spending another night alone with his thoughts, before he could talk himself out of it, John knocked. The sound was soft, almost tentative, and he held his breath as he waited. A moment later, the door opened, and there was Alex, his eyes widening in surprise as he saw John standing there. For a moment, neither of them spoke. John could see the uncertainty in Alex's eyes, the question that lingered unspoken between them. He opened his mouth, trying to find the words, but nothing came out. Instead, he just looked at Alex, his eyes pleading, hoping that Alex could understand what he couldn't say. Alex stepped aside, silently inviting him in, and John walked past him, his heart pounding in his ears. The door closed softly behind them, and they stood there, a few feet apart, the tension thick in the air. John could feel the weight of everything he had left unsaid, the fear, the confusion, the longing. He took a deep breath, his eyes meeting Alex's, and he could see the hurt there, the way Alex was trying to hide it, trying to be patient. It made John's chest ache, made him realize just how much he had missed this, how much he had missed Alex. "I'm sorry," John finally whispered, his voice cracking. It was all he could manage, but it felt like the truth, felt like the only thing he could say. Alex's expression softened, the hurt in his eyes fading just a little, replaced by something else, something that looked like hope. "It's okay," Alex said quietly, his voice gentle. "You don't have to explain. Just stay." John nodded, his throat too tight to speak, and Alex took a step forward, closing the distance between them. He reached out, his hand resting lightly on John's arm, and the touch was enough to make John's eyes fill with tears. He had been so scared, so afraid of what this meant. But now, standing here with Alex, it didn't feel so frightening. It felt like maybe, just maybe, he could let himself hope again. They moved to the couch, the same couch where they had shared that first kiss, and sat down. The silence between them was different now, not heavy with unspoken fears, but gentle, filled with understanding. John leaned back, his head resting against the cushions, and closed his eyes. Alex was next to him, his presence a steady comfort, and John felt the tension slowly begin to ease from his body. He still didn't have all the answers, still didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in days, he felt like he could breathe again. Alex reached for his hand, his fingers intertwining with John's, and John let out a shaky breath, a small smile tugging at his lips. It wasn't perfect, and they still had so much to figure out, but for now, it was enough. They sat there, the room growing darker as the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, and John felt a sense of peace settle over him. He wasn't alone. He had Alex, and maybe, just maybe, that was all he needed to start finding his way forward. The attempt to run had been driven by fear, by the uncertainty of what he was feeling, but coming back had been driven by something stronger. The need to not lose what he had found with Alex. It was still new, still fragile, but it was real, and John was finally ready to stop running, to let himself believe in the possibility of something good. As they sat there, their hands clasped together, John knew that whatever came next, they would face it together, one step at a time. The days after John's return to Alex's apartment felt different. There was a quiet shift between them, a sense that they had crossed a threshold that couldn't be undone. It wasn't a grand, dramatic change, but a gentle one, like the slow turning of a season. Longer fear and uncertainty were still there, lurking in the background, but they no longer felt as overwhelming. Instead, there was something new, a fragile, hopeful sense of possibility that seemed to hang in the air whenever they were together. John found himself spending more and more time at Alex's apartment. The familiar space that had once been just another neighbor's place now felt like a haven, a refuge from the confusion and chaos of his own thoughts. The couch, where they had shared their first kiss, became a place where they could sit together, talk, or simply be in each other's company without the pressure of needing to define what they were. There was a comfort in the silence that stretched between them, a silence that wasn't empty but filled with the warmth of understanding. One evening, as they sat on the couch, a soft rain began to fall outside, tapping gently against the windows. John leaned back, his head resting on the cushions, his eyes half closed as he listened to the rhythmic sound. Alex was next to him, his hand resting lightly on John's knee, his thumb tracing small, absent-minded circles. It was such a simple gesture, but it made John's heart swell with something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of belonging. He turned his head slightly, his eyes meeting Alex's, and in that moment, he felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. Gratitude for Alex's patience, for his kindness, for the way he had waited without pushing, without demanding more than John could give. They hadn't talked much about what they were, about what this meant for their future. It was still too soon, too uncertain, and John wasn't sure he had the words to express everything he was feeling. But Alex seemed to understand, seemed to know that John needed time. He never pushed, never asked for more than John was ready to give, and that made all the difference. It allowed John to relax, to let go of some of the fear that had been holding him back, to let himself feel without the pressure of needing to label it or make sense of it. There were still moments of doubt, moments when John would find himself pulled back into the memories of Emily, of the life they had shared, of the future they had once planned together. He would wonder if he was doing the right thing, if he was making a mistake, if he was setting himself up for more heartbreak. But then Alex would be there, his quiet presence a steady anchor, reminding John that it was okay to not have all the answers, that it was okay to just be. It wasn't about replacing what he had lost. It was about finding something new, something that was different but just him. One night, as they sat on the floor of Alex's living room, a game of cards spread out between them. John found himself laughing, a deep, genuine laugh that seemed to bubble up from somewhere inside him that he had thought was long gone. Alex had made a joke, something silly and lighthearted, and the sound of John's laughter seemed to fill the room, chasing away the shadows that had lingered there for so long. Alex looked at him, his eyes crinkling at the corners, a smile spreading across his face. And in that moment, John realized just how much he had missed this. The simple joy of being happy, of sharing a moment of lightness with someone who cared. As the laughter faded, John reached out, his hand brushing against Alex's. Their eyes met, and for a moment, everything else seemed to fade away. The fear, the uncertainty, the doubts. All that mattered was this moment, the warmth of Alex's hand in his, the softness in his gaze. John took a deep breath, his fingers intertwining with Alex's, and he gave him a small, tentative smile. It wasn't a promise, not yet, but it was a beginning. A step towards something new, something that John was finally ready to let himself hope for. They spent more nights like that, the two of them together, the world outside fading away as they built something new, something that was theirs. It wasn't always easy. There were still moments when John felt the old fears creeping back in, moments when he wanted to pull away, to retreat back into the safety of what he knew. But each time, Alex was there, his patience and understanding a constant reminder that it was okay to take things slow, that it was okay to be unsure. And slowly, bit by bit, John found himself letting go of the need to control everything. Then he let himself lean into the uncertainty, let himself trust that whatever came next, they would face it together. One morning, John woke up to find Alex already awake, sitting by the window, a cup of coffee in his hands. The sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting a warm glow over the room, and John watched him for a moment, his heart swelling with a mixture of emotions he couldn't quite name. It wasn't just about the attraction, about the physical connection they had found. It was about the way Alex made him feel safe, seen, understood. It was about the way Alex had been there, quietly, patiently, waiting for John to find his way back to himself. John got up, crossing the room to stand beside Alex. He reached out, his hand resting on Alex's shoulder, and Alex looked up at him, a soft smile playing on his lips. They didn't need words in that moment. The silence between them was enough, filled with the unspoken understanding that they were in this together, that whatever came next, they would face it side by side. John leaned down, pressing a gentle kiss to Alex's forehead, and then sat down beside him, his head resting against Alex's shoulder as they watched the morning unfold outside the window. It was a new beginning, not perfect, not without its challenges, but real. And for the first time in a long time, John felt like he could see a future that wasn't defined by the past, a future that was full of possibility. He knew there would still be difficult days, still be moments when the fear and doubt would resurface. But he also knew that he wasn't alone anymore. He had Alex, and together, they could face whatever came their way. The new beginning wasn't about forgetting what had happened, about pretending that the pain and heartbreak hadn't existed. It was about moving forward, about finding a way to let the past be a part of him without letting it define him. It was about opening himself up to the possibility of something good, something that could grow and flourish if he was willing to nurture it. And as he sat there, his hand resting in Alex's, John knew that he was ready to do just that. One step at a time, one day at a time, he was ready to build something new, something that was his and Alex's, something that was worth fighting for,